Hey, it's Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini, and I post weekly crafting and cooking videos here on YouTube. This week I'm back with the next step in our video quilt along, which is squaring up our quilt blocks. If you're not a quilter, or maybe you're just not interested in my video quilt along, no worries, I'm going to leave you right here with links to 2 of my other crafting tutorials. So our quilt blocks are designed to be 12.5 inches squared before they're sewn into the quilt. Meaning once I start piecing this block together with either my sashing or the next block, I'm going to take up a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each of the 4 sides, making the finished block in the quilt just 12 inches squared. That's in a perfect world what we'd end up with, right? But I don't want you to freak out if as you're trying to trim these down, you realize that they don't measure 12.5 inches squared. I don't want you to worry about that. What I want you to focus on is trying to trim them down so that they're all symmetrical and they all are at least within 1/8 of an inch measurements from each other, okay? If you start off with even or close to being even blocks, it's gonna make piecing the full quilt top a lot easier for you, and then you'll have a better chance of ending up with a fully squared quilt. To trim up our blocks, we're gonna need just a few things: our rotary cutter, some rulers, okay, that measure at least the 12.5 inches wide that we want our blocks to be. Or you can also purchase one of these rulers that is basically the exact size that you want your blocks to be, 12.5 inches by 12.5 inches. And so if you just laid it on top like this, you can see whether your block is smaller or bigger than what you need it to be, and you can trim away around the outside. An optional device that you can have is one of these rotating cutting mats. And this comes in really handy, especially for trimming down blocks, because you don't have to pick up the fabric and move it. You can simply put it and cut around it and then rotate the mat and cut the other way. And so you get everything nice and trimmed up. Obviously, you'd be using a ruler on here as well. But this really makes it a lot easier so that you don't have to pick up the fabric and move it. You can just rotate the mat however you need it to be. So the first thing you want to do is measure your quilt blocks. And I'm going to measure every single one, and I'm going to put them into different stacks based on the measurements that I get. What you're going to do is measure across the seam line, at least in 2 different spots across your block. And the reason I like the seam line is because it's a little bit more stabilized as opposed to the ends here, where maybe while you're moving it or trying to press the seams and stuff, you might skew that a little bit. I want to go with the body of the block, which I'm going to use this seam here. Oops, let's measure it this way. And I can see I'm about 1/8 of an inch off. 1/8 of an inch off, in my opinion, is okay to be off, because if I'm sewing and I need to pull it another extra 1/8 of an inch, I feel like 1/8 of an inch is okay for me to tug it and make it fit, and that'll work fine. Anything larger than that, then you either have to trim or redo the block. So let's measure at the other seam here, and again, I'm off by 1/8 of an inch. So this block, I'm going to stack it in a little pile for the ones that are smaller than the size I need it to be, which is 12.5 inches squared. Next block here, let's measure across one of these seams. I'm over by 1/4 of an inch, so that's quite a bit there. And the other way, the same thing. I'm over even by more, I think. So this I'm going to put in a pile for now of blocks that are larger than what I need them to be. And you can see that if I decided to just trim this down by 1/4 of an inch, I'm going to have a problem, because I already have my exact 1/4 of an inch extra here. So if I cut away my 1/4 of an inch, that then puts me at the tip of the block here where the colored fabric is. And then if I sew, once it's there, if I sew another 1/4 inch, I'm not going to have any points, and you can see that's going to get cut off. So I have to figure out what I'm going to do with this. I'll probably have to end up remaking the block. But let's move on to the next one here. Let's measure across these seams. This is exactly 12.5. I'm over by a little bit more, less than 1/8 of an inch, so that's fine. I'll say that that's exact as well. And then this way, I'm 12.5 exactly. So we'll start an extra pile here for the ones that are exactly what I need them to be. And so by doing this, you can kind of separate and see what you have more of and figure out what you need to trim your blocks down to. Let's measure this one across the center here, 12.5 exactly. And on this end, 1/8 of an inch off, but that's fine. So I'll put this in the one that's the same size. And you're going to continue to do this for all your blocks. So then you can basically start off with your plan of attack on what you're going to do to get them to be as even as you can get them before we can actually start sewing them together or thinking about sewing them together. So I didn't do too bad here. You can see I have my 3 piles. This is the one that all measure 12.5 inches squared, or within 1/8 of an inch of that measurement. then I have one that's a little bit smaller, and I have one that's a little bit bigger. So what I'll probably end up doing is making 2 more blocks, because this one's a little bit too small for me to be able to stretch it, and then this one's a little bit too big that what I mentioned earlier, if I cut it to trim it down to 1/4 inch, then after I sew it, I'm not going to have those points, which you can always do as well. It would just have a different look to your block, and you wouldn't have those crisp points. If you need to redo any blocks like I need to do here, this is the time to make them. And then what you're going to do with the ones that we measured that is close enough, all I like to do is actually trim up the edges. There may be some spots where I have a little extra here or there. And in this case, I'm just going to put my 12.5-inch square ruler on top. And if you'd like to line it up, make sure everything is in the center. We're lining up the 6 1/4 inch mark right down the center line. In this case, this block happens to have a seam there, so it works out nicely that I can measure against that. But remember, we're measuring with 6 1/4 because that's half of the 12.5 that we need. So you can see that if I bump everything up right where I want it, this one is just a touch bigger on all sides. Well, on a couple of the sides. So I'm just going to hold my ruler here, trim, and then you're going to repeat that to all your blocks just to trim them up to size. Another option you have is using this rotating rotary cutting mat, and I'll do one block here so you can see. Okay, there looks good enough. You can cut on 2 sides. And then I'm just going to turn it and do what I just did on the remaining 2 sides. You can turn it again and do that last side. And so that really helps so that I'm never bringing the rotary cutter towards me, and it's probably one of the safer ways to cut around all 4 sides without having to pick up the block and turn it over. If you don't have a rotating mat, go ahead and trim them up like we do other blocks. You can measure across here. This is 12.5 exactly. So I know that all I have to do is bump up here with the 90-degree angle of my corner, as close, as far over as I can get it without trimming away too much from my block. And then I'm just going to cut any extra little snippet of threads. Just that much to get it to be a straight line. And remember, when we cut one side, then you want to turn the whole thing over and cut the opposite parallel side. Okay, if you cut one side and then the next perpendicular side, what you're going to do is you're going to end up with a square, but the pattern or the design of the block itself may be skewed a little bit. So you want to keep everything as equally balanced as possible. So we cut this side, I turned it over, now I'm going to cut here. The ones that you have to look out for are the ones that have blocks like this where it's already included in the design of the block, this 1/4 inch seam allowance. If they're a little bit smaller than they can be, you're either going to have to work with the design and just end up with something where you don't have the actual point, or you'll have to end up redoing it. Now if you recall, this one is smaller than what I need it to be, and this one is bigger. If in your case, say all your blocks are smaller than the 12.5 inches square, I would again break it off into piles and figure out, are most of them 12 inches, are most of them 12 1/4, or whatever it is, so then you can figure out what you need to trim down all the other blocks to, so you can end up with the majority being the same. Just keep in mind again, if you have these blocks that finish like this with the 1/4 inch, you need to figure out, make an executive decision about what you want to do about that. Either create another block or just end up with a block that has no points there. So your homework for next time is to trim down all your blocks to get them to be the same size or as close as you can get it to be. And then next time we'll be talking about some different options for piecing your quilt top together. You can either bump up one block right next to the other, which I'm sure you've probably already played around with, but I'm also going to be giving you an option to do some sashing. And sashing is basically just strips of fabric. We're just going to keep it simple and do a solid piece of fabric, but there's other different designs out there that are a little more complex. But for this one, we're going to keep it nice and simple. And you can see, like the sashing I did here in between these blocks, it basically is just a strip of fabric that's going to separate the blocks and kind of frames them out to give them a different look. So if this is something that you think you're interested in doing, consider some of the different fabric choices. I'll tell you what I'm probably going to do. Since all my blocks are made up of a ton of different colors and scraps, I'm probably going to go with a neutral color. Maybe a white, a cream, or even a light gray I think would go good for the sashing in my quilt. And so I encourage you to consider some different sashing options as well. When I get to that tutorial, I'll be teaching you how to take measurements of the different quilt blocks and how many blocks you have so you can figure out how much fabric you'll be needing for your sashing as well. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial on how to square up your quilt blocks, and go do your homework. I'll see you in the next lesson. And keep me posted on your progress by posting pictures or updates on my Facebook page. I love to see what you guys are making from the Crafty Gemini tutorials.